On a stormy night in March, not long ago, a respectable taxi driver named Ebenezer Jones found himself driving home, very late, through the somewhat wild and sinister district of London known as Rumbury Town. Mr. Jones was passing the long, desolate piece of land called Rumbury Waste when, in the street, not far ahead, he observed a large, dark, upright object moving slowly from one side of the street to the other. Mr. Jones had approached to within about 20 yards of this object when a motorcyclist with a pillion passenger shot by him at a reckless pace and cutting in very close. Mr. Jones braked sharply, looking in his rearview mirror, and when he looked forward again, he saw that the motorcycle must have struck the upright object in passing, for it was now lying on its side, just ahead of his front wheels. He brought his taxi to a halt. Not but what I dare say I'm being foolish, he thought. There's plenty in this part of town that's best left alone. But you can't see something like that happen without stopping to have a look. He got out of his cab. What he found in the road was a large black bird, almost 2 feet long, with a hairy fringe round its beak. At first he thought it was dead, but as he got nearer, it opened one eye slightly and then shut it again. Poor thing, it's probably stunned, thought Mr. Jones. And he went back to his cab for the bottle of brandy and teaspoon he always carried in the toolkit in case lady passengers turned faint. Now, it's not at all easy to give brandy to a large bird lying unconscious in the road. After 5 minutes there was a good deal of brandy on the cobbles, and some up Mr. Jones's sleeve, and some in his shoes. But he couldn't be sure that any had actually gone down the bird's throat. The difficulty was that he needed at least 3 hands, one to hold the bottle, one to hold the spoon, and one to hold the bird's beak open. If he prized open the beak with the handle of the teaspoon, it was sure to shut again before he'd time to reverse the spoon and tip in some brandy. Suddenly, a hand fell on Mr. Jones's shoulder. "Just what do you think you're doing?" inquired one of 2 policemen who had left their van and was standing over him. The other sniffed in a disapproving manner. Mr. Jones straightened slowly. I was just giving some brandy to this rook," he explained. He was rather embarrassed because he'd spilt such a lot. "Rook? That's no rook," said the officer who had sniffed. "That's a raven. Look at its hairy beak." "Well, whatever it is, it's stunned," said Mr. Jones. "A motorbike hit it." "Ah," said the other officer, "that'll have been one of the pair who just pinched 30,000 quid from the bank in the High Street. It's the Cash and Carrot boys, the ones who've done a lot of burglaries round here lately. Did you see which way they went?" "No," said Mr. Jones, tipping up the raven's head, "but they'll have a dent on their bike. Could one of you hold the bottle for me?" "You don't want to give him brandy. Hot sweet tea's what you want to give him." "That's right," said the other policeman, "and an ice pack under the back of his neck. Burn feathers in front of his beak. Slap his hands. Undo his shoelaces. Put him in the fridge." "He hasn't got any shoelaces," said Mr. Jones, not best pleased at all by this advice. "If you aren't going to hold the bottle, why don't you go and catch the blokes that knocked him over?" "Ah, well, they'll be well away by now. Besides, they carry guns." "We'll go back to the station," said the first policeman, "and you'd better not stay here, giving intoxicating liquor to a bird, or we might have to take you in for loitering in a suspicious manner." "Well, I can't just leave the bird here in the road," said Mr. Jones. "Take it with you, then." "Well, can't you take it to the station?" "Not likely," said the second policeman. "No facilities for ravens there." They stood with folded arms watching while Mr. Jones slowly picked up the bird and put it in his taxi, and they were still watching as he started up and drove off. So, that was how Mr. Jones happened to take the raven back with him to number 6 Rainwater Crescent, northwest 3½, on a windy March night. When he got home, nobody was up, which was not surprising since it was after midnight. He would have liked to wake his daughter Arabelle, who was fond of all birds and animals, but since she was quite young, she hadn't started school yet, he thought he'd better not. And he knew he must not wake his wife Martha, because she had to be at work at Round and Round, the gramophone shop in the High Street, at 9 in the morning. He laid the raven on the kitchen floor, opened the window to give it air, put on the kettle for hot sweet tea, and while he had the match lit, burned a feather duster under the raven's beak. Nothing happened except that the smoke made Mr. Jones cough. He saw no way of slapping the raven's hands or undoing its shoelaces, so he took some ice cubes and a jug of milk from the fridge. He left the fridge door open because his hands were full, and anyway, it usually swung shut by itself. With great care, he slid a little row of ice cubes under the back of the raven's neck. The kettle boiled, and he made the tea. A spoonful for each person, and one for the pot. 3 in all. He also spread himself a slice of bread and fish paste, because he didn't see why he shouldn't have a little something as well as the bird. He poured out a cup of tea for himself and an egg cupful for the raven, putting plenty of sugar in both. But when he turned round, egg cup in hand, the raven had gone. "Bless me," Mr. Jones said. "There's ingratitude for you. After all my trouble. I suppose he flew out of the window. Those ice cubes certainly did the trick quick. I wonder if it would be a good notion to carry some ice cubes with me in the cab. I could put them in a vacuum flask. Yes, might be better than brandy if lady passengers turn faint." Thinking these thoughts, he finished his tea and the raven's, no sense in leaving it to get cold, turned out the light and went to bed. In the middle of the night he thought, "Did I put the milk back in the fridge?" And he thought, "No, I didn't." And he thought, "I ought to get up and put it away." And then he thought, "Well, it's a cold night. The milk's not going to turn between now and breakfast. Besides, Thursday tomorrow, it's my early day." So he rolled over and went to sleep. Every Thursday Mr. Jones drove the local fishmonger, Mr. Finney, over to Colchester to buy oysters at 5 in the morning. So early next day, up he got and off he went. Made himself a cup of tea, finished the milk in the jug, and never looked in the fridge. An hour after he'd gone, Mrs. Jones got up and put on the kettle. Finding the milk jug empty, she went yawning to the fridge and pulled the door open, not noticing that it had been prevented from shutting properly by the handle of a burnt feather duster which had fallen against the hinge. But she noticed what was inside the fridge all right. She let out a shriek that brought Arabelle running downstairs. Arabelle was little and fair, with grey eyes. She was wearing a white nightdress that made her look like a lampshade with 2 feet sticking out from the bottom. One of the feet had on a blue sock. "What's the matter, Ma?" she said. "There's a great awful bird in the fridge," sobbed Mrs. Jones, "and it's eaten all the cheese and a blackcurrant tart and 5 pints of milk and a bowl of dripping and a pound of sausages. All that's left is the lettuce." "Then we'll have lettuce for breakfast," said Arabelle. But Mrs. Jones said she didn't fancy lettuce that had spent the night in the fridge with the great awful bird. "And how are we going to get it out of there?" "The lettuce?" "The bird," said Mrs. Jones, switching off the kettle and pouring hot water into a pot without any tea in it. Arabelle opened the fridge door, which had swung shut. There sat the bird among the empty milk bottles. There was a certain amount of wreckage round him, torn foil and cheese wrappings and milk splashes and bits of pastry and crumbs of dripping and rejected lettuce leaves. Arabelle looked at the raven, and he looked back at her. "His name's Mortimer," she said. "No, it's not! No, it's not!" cried Mrs. Jones, taking a loaf from the bread bin and absent-mindedly running the tap over it. "We said you could have a hamster when you were 5, or a puppy, or a kitten when you were 6, and of course call it what you wish. Oh, my stars, look at that creature's toenails, if nails they can be called, but not a bird like that, a great, hairy, awful thing eating us out of house and home, as big as a fire extinguisher and all black." But Arabelle was looking at the raven, and he was looking back at her. "His name's Mortimer," she said. And she put both arms round the raven, not an easy thing to do, all jammed in among the milk bottles as he was, and lifted him out. "He's very heavy," she said, and set him down on the kitchen floor. "So I should think, considering he's got a pound of sausages, a bowl of dripping, 5 pints of milk, half a pound of New Zealand cheddar, and a blackcurrant tart inside him," said Mrs. Jones. "I'll open the window. Perhaps he'll fly out." She opened the window, but Mortimer did not fly out. He was busy examining everything in the kitchen very thoroughly. He tapped the table legs with his beak. They were metal and clinked. Then he took everything out of the waste bin, a pound of peanut shells, 2 empty tins, and some jam tart cases. He particularly liked the jam tart cases, which he pushed under the lino. Then he walked over to the fireplace. It was an old-fashioned kitchen, and began chipping out the mortar from between the bricks. Mrs. Jones had been gazing at the raven as if she were under a spell, but when he began on the fireplace, she said, "Don't let him do that!" "Mortimer," said Arabelle, "we'd like you not to do that, please." Mortimer turned his head right round on its black feathery neck and gave Arabelle a thoughtful, considering look. Then he made his first remark, which was a deep, hoarse, rasping croak. It said, as plainly as words, "Well, all right, I won't do it this time, but I make no promise that I won't do it sometime, and I think you are being unreasonable." "Wouldn't you like to see the rest of the house, Mortimer?" said Arabelle. And she held open the kitchen door. Mortimer walked, he never hopped, very slowly through into the hall and looked at the stairs. They seemed to interest him greatly. He began going up them hand over hand, or rather beak over claw. When he was halfway up, the telephone rang. It stood on the windowsill at the foot of the stairs, and Mortimer watched as Mrs. Jones came to answer it. Mr. Jones was ringing from Colchester to ask if his wife wanted any oysters.
"Oysters?" she said. "That bird you left in the fridge has eaten sausages, cheese, dripping blackcurrant tart, drunk 5 pints of milk, now he's chewing the stairs, and you ask if I want oysters. Perhaps I should feed him caviar as well."
"Bird I left in the fridge?" Mr. Jones was puzzled. "What bird, Martha?"
"That great black crow, or whatever it is. Arabelle calls it Mortimer, and she's leading it all over the house now, and now it's taken all the spools of cotton from my sewing drawer and is pushing them under the doormat."
"Not it, Ma. He, Mortimer,"
said Arabelle, going to open the front door and take the letters from the postman. But Mortimer got there first and received the letters in his beak. The postman was so startled that he dropped his whole sack of mail in a puddle and gasped, "Never more will I stay later than 10:30 at the Oddfellows' ball, or touch a drop stronger than Caribbean lemon. Never more."
"Never more,"
said Mortimer, pushing 2 bills and a postcard under the doormat. Then he retrieved the postcard again by spearing it clean through the middle. Mrs. Jones let out a wail.
"Arabelle, will you come in out of the street in your nightie? Look what that bird's done, chewing up the gas bill. Nevermore, indeed. I should just about say it was Nevermore. No, I don't want any oysters, Ebenezer Jones, and please shut the front door and stop that bird from pushing all those plastic flowers under the stair carpet."
Mr. Jones couldn't understand all this, so he rang off. Meanwhile, Mortimer had climbed upstairs and was in the bathroom trying the taps. It took him less than 5 minutes to work out how to turn them on. He liked to watch the cold water running, but the hot, with its clouds of steam, for some reason, annoyed him, and he began throwing things at the hot tap, bits of soap, sponges, nail brushes, face cloths. They choked up the plug hole, and within a short time the water had overflowed and was flooding the bathroom.
"Mortimer, I think you'd better not stay in the bathroom," Arabelle said.
Mortimer was good at giving black looks. He gave Arabelle a black look, but she took no notice. She had a red truck which had once been filled with wooden building bricks. The bricks had been lost long ago, but the truck was in good repair.
"Mortimer, wouldn't you like a ride in this red truck?"
Mortimer thought he would. He climbed into the truck and stood there waiting. Arabelle took hold of the handle and started pulling him along. When Mrs. Jones noticed Arabelle, she nearly had a fit.
"It's not bad enough that you've adopted that great, big, ugly, sulky bird, but you have to pull him in a truck. Don't his legs work? Why can't he walk, may I ask?"
"He doesn't feel like walking just now,"
Arabelle said. "Of course, and I suppose he's forgotten how to fly."
"I like pulling him on the truck,"
Arabelle said, and she pulled him into the garden. Presently Mrs. Jones went off to work at Round and Round, the gramophone shop, and Granny came in to look after Arabelle. All Granny ever did was sit and knit. She liked answering the phone too, but now every time it rang, Mortimer got there first, picked up the receiver and said, "Nevermore." People who rang up to order taxis were puzzled and said to one another, "Mr. Jones must have retired." They had baked beans for lunch. Mortimer enjoyed the baked beans, but his table manners were very light-hearted. He liked knocking spoons and forks off the table, pushing them under the rush matting and fetching them out again with a lot of excitement. Granny wasn't so keen on this. While Granny was having her nap, Arabelle looked at comics and Mortimer looked at the stairs. There seemed to be something about stairs that appealed to him. When Mr. Jones came home at tea time, the first thing he said was, "What's happened to the 3 bottom steps?"
"What has, then?"
asked Granny, who was short-sighted and anyway busy spreading jam. "They aren't there."
"It wasn't Mortimer's fault," said Arabelle. "He didn't know we need the stairs."
"Mortimer? Who's Mortimer?" Just then Mrs. Jones came home. "That bird has got to go," said Mr. Jones accusingly the minute she'd put down her shopping basket and taken off her coat.
"Who's talking? You were the one who left him in the fridge."
Mortimer looked morose and sulky and black at Mr. Jones's words. He sank his head between his shoulders and ruffled up the beard round his beak and turned his toes in as if he didn't care one way or the other. But Arabelle went so white that her father thought she was going to faint.
"If Mortimer goes," she said, "I shall cry all the time. Very likely I shall die."
"Oh, well," said Mr. Jones, "but mind, if he stays, he's not to eat any more stairs." Just the same, during the next week or so, Mortimer did chew up 6 more stairs. The family had to go to bed by climbing a ladder. Luckily, it was an aluminium fruit ladder, or Mortimer would have probably chewed that up too. He was very fond of wood. There was a bit of trouble because he wanted to sleep in the fridge every night, but Mrs. Jones put a stop to that, and in the end he agreed to sleep in the airing cupboard. Then there was a bit more trouble because he pushed all the soap and toothbrushes under the bathroom lino, and they couldn't get the door open. The fire brigade had to climb through the window. "He's not to be left alone in the house," Mr. Jones said. "On the days when Arabelle goes to playgroup, Martha, he'll have to go to work with you."
"Why can't he come to playgroup with me?"
Arabelle asked. Mr. Jones just laughed at that question. Mrs. Jones was not enthusiastic about taking Mortimer to work with her.
"So I'm to pull him up the high street on that red truck? You must be joking."
"He can ride in your shopping bag on wheels," Arabelle said. "He'll like that."
At first, the owners of the gramophone shop, Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round, were quite pleased to have Mortimer sitting on the counter. People who lived in Rumbury Town heard about the Raven in the record shop and were curious. They came in out of curiosity, and then they played records, and then, often as not, bought the records. And at first Mortimer was so astonished at the music that he sat still on the counter for hours at a time, looking like a stuffed bird. At tea time, when Arabelle came home from playgroup, she told him what she'd been doing and pulled him round on the red truck. But presently Mortimer became bored by just sitting, listening to music. He took to answering the telephone and saying, "Nevermore," and then he began taking triangular bites out of the edges of records. After that, it wasn't so easy to sell them. Then he noticed the spiral stairs which led down to the classic and folk departments. One morning, Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round and Mrs. Jones were all very busy arranging a display of new issues in the shop window. When they'd finished, they discovered that Mortimer had eaten the spiral staircase. "Mrs. Jones, you and your bird will have to go. We have kind, long-suffering natures, but Mortimer has done £817.67 worth of damage. You may have a year to repay it. Please don't trouble to come in ever again."
"Glad I am I haven't such a kind, long-suffering nature," snapped Mrs. Jones, and she dumped Mortimer on top of her wheeled shopping basket and dragged him home. "Stairs," she said to Arabelle. "What's the use of a bird who eats stairs? Gracious knows there's enough rubbish in the world. Why can't he eat tonic bottles or ice cream cartons or used cars or oil slicks? Tell me that. But no, he has to eat the only thing that joins the upstairs to the downstairs." "Nevermore," said Mortimer. "Oh, tell that to the Space Cavalry," said Mrs. Jones.
Arabelle and Mortimer went and sat side by side on the bottom rung of the fruit ladder, leaning against one another and very quiet.
"When I'm grown up," Arabelle said to Mortimer, "we'll live in a house with 100 stairs, and you can eat them all."
Meanwhile, since the bank raid on the night Mr. Jones had found Mortimer, several more places in Rumbury Town had been burgled. Brown's the ironmonger's, and Mr. Finney the fishmonger, and the Tutti Frutti Sweetie shop. On the day after Mrs. Jones left Round and Round, she found another job at Peter Stone the jeweller's in the High Street. She had to take both Arabelle and Mortimer with her to work, since playgroup was finished till after Easter, and Granny had gone to Southend for a visit. Arabelle pulled Mortimer to the shop every day on the red truck. Peter Stone had no objection to their coming. "The more people in the shop, the less chance of a hold-up," he said. "Too much we are hearing about these cash and carrot boys for my taste. Raided the supermarket yesterday, they did. Took 1,000 tins of best Jamaica blend coffee, as the cash box was jammed. Coffee? What would they want with 1,000 tins?"
"Perhaps they were thirsty," Arabelle said.
She and Mortimer were looking at their reflections in a glass case full of bracelets. Mortimer tapped the glass in an experimental way with his beak. "That bird now," Peter Stone said, giving Mortimer a thoughtful look. "He'll behave himself. He won't go swallowing any diamonds. That brooch he's looking at now is worth £40,000. Mrs. Jones drew herself up.
"Behave himself? Naturally he'll behave himself. And any diamonds he swallows I guarantee to replace."
A police sergeant came into the shop. "I've a message for your husband," he said to Mrs. Jones. "We've found a motorbike, and we'd be glad if he'd step up to the station and say if he can identify it as the one that passed him on the night the bank was robbed." And then he saw Mortimer. "Is that the bird that got knocked over? He'd better come along as well. We can see if he fits the dent in the petrol tank." "Nevermore," said Mortimer, who was eyeing a large clock under a glass dome. "Here, he'd better not talk like that to the super," the sergeant said, "or he'll be charged with obstructing the police." "Have they any theories about the identity of the gang?" Peter Stone asked. No, they always wear masks, but we're pretty sure they're locals and have got a hideout somewhere in the district because we always lose track of them so fast. One odd feature is that they have a very small accomplice about the size of that bird there, the sergeant said, giving Mortimer a hard stare. How do you know? Well, when they robbed the supermarket, someone got in through the manager's cat door and opened a window from inside. If birds had fingerprints, the sergeant said, I wouldn't mind taking the dabs of that shifty-looking fowl. He could get through a cat door easy enough.
Your opinions are uncalled for, said Mrs. Jones. Thoughtless our Mortimer may be, untidy at times, but honest as a bath bun, I'll have you know. And the night the supermarket was robbed, he was in our airing cupboard, with his head tucked under his wing.
I've known some bath buns, not all they should be, said the sergeant.
Ah!
Said Mortimer. 5 minutes after the sergeant had gone, Peter Stone went off for his lunch. And 5 minutes after that, 2 masked men walked into the shop. One of them pointed a gun at Mrs. Jones and Arabel. The other smashed a glass case and took out the diamond brooch which Peter Stone had said was worth £40,000. Out of the gunman's pocket clambered a grey squirrel with an extremely villainous expression. It looked hopefully round the shop. Piece of apple pie, this job, said the masked man who'd taken the diamond. We'll give Sam the brooch and he could use the bird to hitch a ride to our pad. Then if the cops should stop us, they can't pin anything on us. Mortimer, who was eating one of the cheese sandwiches Mrs. Jones had brought for her lunch, suddenly found a gun jammed against his ribs. The squirrel jumped on his back. You'd better cooperate, coalface, the gunman said. This is a flyjack. Fly where Sam tells you, or you'll be blown to 40 bits. Sam carries a bomb round his neck on a shoelace. All he's got to do is pull the pin out with his teeth.
Oh, please, don't blow up Mortimer, Arabel said to the gunman. I think he's forgotten how to fly.
Well, he'd better remember pretty fast.
Oh, dear Mortimer, perhaps you'd better do what they say.
With a creak that could be heard all over the jeweller's shop, Mortimer unfolded his wings and, to his own surprise as much as anyone else's, flew out through the open door. The 2 thieves walked calmly after him. As soon as they were gone, Mrs. Jones went into hysterics and Arabel rang the alarm buzzer. In no time, a police van bounced to a stop outside with sirens screaming and lights flashing, and Peter Stone came rushing back from the fish bar. Mrs. Jones was still having hysterics, but Arabel said,
2 masked gunmen stole a diamond brooch and gave it to a squirrel to carry away, and he's flown off on our Raven. Please get him back.
Where did the 2 men go?
They just walked off up the high street.
All sounds like a fishy tale to me, said the police sergeant. It was the same one who'd been in earlier. You sure you didn't just give the brooch to the bird and tell him to flit off with it to the nearest stolen property dealer?
Oh, how could you say such a thing? Wept Mrs. Jones, when our Mortimer's the best-hearted raven in Rumbury Town, even if he does look a bit black at times.
Any clues? Said the sergeant to his men. There's a trail of cheese crumbs here, said the constable. We'll see how far we can follow 'em. The police left, following the trail of cheese, which led all the way up Rumbury High Street, past the bank, past the fishmonger, past the supermarket, past the ironmonger, past the record shop, past the war memorial, and stopped at the tube station. He's done us, said the sergeant. Went on by tube. Did a large blackbird buy a ticket to anywhere about 10 minutes ago? He asked Mr. Gumbrel, the booking clerk.
No.
He could have got a ticket from a machine, one of the constables pointed out. They all say out of order.
Anyway, why should a bird buy a ticket? He could just fly into a train, said the other constable. Maybe the girl's telling the truth.
All the passengers who travelled on the Rumbaloo line that morning were asked if they'd seen a large blackbird carrying a diamond brooch, and none of them had.
No offence, Mrs. Jones, said Peter Stone, but in these doubtful circumstances I'd just as soon you didn't come back after lunch. We'll say nothing about the £40,000 for the brooch at present. Let's hope the bird is caught with it on him.
He didn't take it, said Arabel. You'll find out.
Arabel and Mrs. Jones walked home to number 6 Rainwater Crescent. Arabel was pale and silent, but Mrs. Jones scolded all the way.
Any bird with a scrap of gumption would have taken the brooch off that wretched little rat of a squirrel. Ashamed of himself he ought to be. Nothing but trouble and aggravation we've had since Mortimer's been in the family. Let's hope that's the last of him.
Arabel said she didn't want any tea and went to bed and cried herself to sleep. When he got home that evening, Mr. Jones went up to the police station and identified the motorbike as the one that had passed him the night the bank had been robbed. Good, said the sergeant. We found a couple of black feathers stuck to a bit of grease on the tank. If you ask me, that bird's up to his beak in all this murky business.
Well, how could he be? Mr. Jones said. He was just crossing the road when the bike went by.
Maybe they slipped him the cash as they passed.
In that case, we'd have seen it, wouldn't we? Do you know who the bike belongs to?
It was found abandoned on the Rumbaloo line embankment, where it comes out the tunnel. We've a theory, but I'm not telling you. Your family is under suspicion. Don't leave the district without informing us.
Mr. Jones said he had no intention of leaving. We want Mortimer found. My daughter's very upset. Arabelle was more than upset. She was in despair. She wandered about the house all day, looking at the things that reminded her of Mortimer. The fireplace bricks without any mortar, the tattered hearthrug, the plates with beak-sized chips missing, the chewed upholstery, all the articles that turned up under carpets and lino, and the missing stairs. The carpenter hadn't come yet to replace them, and Mr. Jones was too dejected to nag him. "I wouldn't have thought I'd get fond of a bird so quick," he said. "I miss his sulky black face and his thoughtful ways and the sound of him crunching about the house. Eat up your tea, Arabelle, dearie, there's a good girl. I expect Mortimer will find his way home by and by." But Arabelle couldn't eat. Tears ran down her nose and onto her bread and jam until it was all soggy. That reminded her of the flood that Mortimer had caused by blocking up the bath plug, and tears rolled even faster. "Mortimer doesn't know our address," she said. "He doesn't even know our name."
"We'll offer £5 reward for Mortimer's return," Mr. Jones said.
£5?
cried Mrs. Jones, who had just come home from the supermarket where she now worked.
£5 you offer for the return of that black fiend, when already we owe £817.67 to Round and Round, let alone the 40,000 to Peter Stone.
Just the same, Mr. Jones stuck up his reward sign in the sub-post office, alongside one from Peter Stone, offering £1,000 for information that might lead to the return of his brooch, and a similar one from the bank, the ironmonger, and the fishmonger. Meanwhile, what of Mortimer and the squirrel? They'd flown as far as the tube station, and there Sam, by kicking Mortimer in the ribs and punching the top of his head, had directed him to fly into the station entrance. Rumbury Town Station is very old. The two entrances have big round arches with sliding open-work iron gates, and the station is faced all over with shiny raw meat-coloured tiles. A dark blue enamel sign says, "London General Omnibus and Subterranean Railway Company, by appointment to His Majesty King Edward VII." For nearly 50 years there had been only one slow, creaking old lift to take people down to the trains. A sign on it said, "Not authorised to carry more than 12 passengers." People too impatient to wait for it had to walk down about 1,000 spiral stairs. But lately the station had been modernised by the addition of a handsome pair of escalators, one up, one down, which replaced the spiral stairs. Nothing else was modern. The ticket machines were so old that people said they would only work for a Queen Victoria bun penny. The bookstore was always shut. The chocolate machines had been empty for generations, and down below, as well as the tube platforms, there were all kinds of mysterious old galleries. In the days when trams still ran in London, Rumbury had also been an underground tramway station, connecting with the Kingsway, Aldwych and Spurgeon's Tabernacle line. Not many trains stop at Rumbury Town. Most of them rush straight through from Nutmeg Hill to Cannon's Green. Old Mr. Gumbrel, the booking clerk, was Mr. Jones's uncle. Besides selling tickets, he also ran the lift. He was too short-sighted to see across to the lift from the booking office, so when he had sold 12 tickets, he would lock up the office and take the lift down. This meant that sometimes people had to wait a very long time for a lift, but it didn't much matter, as there probably wouldn't be a train for hours. However, in the end there were complaints, which was why the escalators were installed. Mr. Gumbrel enjoyed riding on these, which he called escatailers. He used to leave the lift at the bottom and travel back up the moving stairs. Well, he did this on the day when Mortimer and the squirrel arrived. He ran the lift slowly down, never noticing that Mortimer, with Sam the squirrel still grimly clutching him, was perched high up near the ceiling on the frame of a poster. Mr. Gumbrel left the lift at the bottom and sailed back up the escalator, mumbling to himself. "Ah, yeah, these here moving stairs do be an amazing wonder of science. Whatever will they think of next?" When Mr. Gumbrel got to the top again, he found the police there, examining the trail of cheese crumbs which stopped outside the station entrance. They stayed a long time, but Mr. Gumbrel could give them no useful information. "Birds and squirrels," he muttered when they'd gone. "Yeah, is it likely you'd be a-seeing birds and squirrels with diamond brooches in a tube station?" The phone rang. There was only one telephone in the station, a public call box with the door missing. So if people wanted to ring up Mr. Gumbrel, which didn't happen very often, they rang on that line. This time it was Mr. Jones.
Is that you, Uncle Arthur? Yeah, of course it's me. Who else would it be?
We just wondered if you'd seen Arabelle's raven. The trail of cheese crumbs led up your way, the police said.
No, I've not seen a raven, snapped Mr. Gumbrel. Coppers are bothering here all afternoon, but still I haven't. Nor I haven't seen a Socrates bird, nor a cassodactyl, nor a terrawurry. This is a tube station, not a zoological garden.
Well, will you keep a lookout just the same? Said Mr. Jones. Mr. Gumbrel thumped back the receiver. He was fed up at all the bother.
If I wait here any longer, likely the militia and the beef guards and the horse eaters and the traffic wardens will be along too. Yeah, I'm closing up.
Runbury Station was not supposed to be closed except between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m, but in fact Mr. Gumbrel often did close it earlier if his bad toe was bothering him. And no one had complained yet.
Even if me toe ain't aching now, likely it'll start any minute with all this willocking about,
Mr. Gumbrel argued to himself. So he switched off the escalators, locked the lift gates and the ticket office, turned out the light, rang up Nutmeg Hill and Cannons Green to tell them not to let any trains stop, padlocked the big main mesh gates, and stomped off home to supper. Next morning, there were several people waiting to catch the first train to work when Mr. Gumbrel arrived to open up. They bustled in as soon as he slid the gates back and didn't stop at the booking office, for they all had season tickets. But when they reached the top of the escalator, they did stop, in dismay and astonishment, for the escalators were not there. Nothing but a big, gaping black hole. "Oh, somebody's pinched the stairs," said a Covent Garden porter. "Don't be so soft. How could you pinch an escalator?" said a milkman. "Well, they're gone, aren't they?" said a bus conductor. "Now, what's your theory? Earthquake? Sunk into the ground?" "Squatters," said a train driver. "Mark my words, squatters have taken them."
"Well, how'd they get through the locked gates? And anyway, what'd they take them for?"
"To squat on, of course." Mr. Gumbrel stood scratching his head.
"I took my escatailers," he said sorrowfully. "What'd they want to go and do that for? If they'd have took the lift now, I wouldn't have minded near as much. Well, all you lot will have to go down in the lift anyways. There ain't 12 of you, so it's all right."
It wasn't all right, though. When he pulled the lever that ought to have brought the lift up, nothing happened. "And I'll tell you why," said the train driver, peering through the closed top gates. "Someone's been and chawed through the lift cable." "Sawed through it?"
"No, kind of chewed or haggled through.
All right, messy job."
Luckily the current was switched off, or whoever done it would have been frizzled like popcorn."
"Someone's been sabotaging the station," said the bus conductor. "Football fans is my guess."
"Hippies, more like."
"Someone ought to tell the cops."
Cops," grumbled Mr. Gumbrel. "Not likely, yes. Had enough of them in yesterday, scavenging about for ravens and squirrels."
Another reason why he didn't want the police called in was because he didn't want to admit that he'd left the station unattended for so long. But the early travellers, finding they couldn't get a train there, walked off to the next stop down the line, Nutmeg Hill. They told their friends at work what had happened, and the story spread. Presently, a reporter from the Runbury Borough News rang up the tube station for confirmation of the tale. "Is that Runbury Station? Can you tell me, please, if the trains are running normally?"
"Nevermore,"
croaked a harsh voice, and the receiver was thumped down. "You'd better go up there and have a look round," said the editor, when his reporter told him of this puzzling conversation. So, the reporter, his name was Dick Otter, took a bus up to the tube station. It was a dark, drizzly, foggy day, and when he peered in through the station entrance, he thought that it looked like a cave inside under the round arches. The ticket machines with their dim little lights were like a sheet of ice. The empty green chocolate machines were like hanks of moss dangling against the walls. And old Mr. Gumbrel, with his white whiskers, seated inside the ticket kiosk, was like some wizened goblin with his little piles of magic cards telling people where they could go. "Is the station open?" Dick asked.
"You walked in, didn't you? Yeah, but you can't go anywhere," said Mr. Gumbrel.
Dick went over and looked at the gaping hole where the moving staircase used to be. Mr. Gumbrel had hung a couple of chains across to stop people falling down. Then Dick peered through the lift gates and down the shaft. Then he went back to Mr. Gumbrel, who was reading yesterday's football results by the light of a candle. It was very dark in the station entrance because nearly all the light switches were down below, and Mr. Gumbrel couldn't get at them. "Who do you think took the escalators?" Dick asked, getting out his notebook. Mr. Gumbrel had been thinking about this a good deal on and off during the morning.
"Spooks," he replied. "Spooks what doesn't like modern inventions. I reckon the station's haunted. As I've been sitting here this morning, there's a ghostly voice what sometimes comes and croaks in me lug-hole. 'Nevermore,' it says. 'Nevermore.' That's one reason why I haven't informed the cops. And what could they do? What that voice means is that this station shall never more be used."
"I see," said Dick thoughtfully. In his notebook he wrote, "Is Tube Station haunted?" or "Is booking clerk round the bend?" "What else makes you think it's haunted?" he asked.
"Well," said Mr. Gumbrel, "there couldn't be anybody downstairs, could there? I locked up last night when the 9 o'clock south had gone, and I phoned 'em at Nutmeg Hill and Cannon's Green not to let any trains stop here till I gave 'em the word again. Now, no one would have gone down this end after that, and yet sometimes I thinks as I can hear voices down the lift shaft a-calling out, 'Help, help!' which is a contradiction of nature, since, like I said, no one could be down there."
"Supposing they'd gone down last night before you locked up?"
"Then they'd have caught the 9 o'clock south, wouldn't they? No, it's ghosties down there, all right."
"Whose ghosts, do you think?"
"It is the ghosties of the old tramcar drivers." And why do I think that? Well, you look at these here tickets."
Mr. Gumbrel showed a pile of green tenpenny tube tickets. Each had a large triangular snip taken from one side.
"You see, a ghostie did that," he said triumphantly. "Who else could have got in my ticket office? The only way in was through the slot, see, where the passengers pays the fares. A human couldn't get through there, but a ghostie could. It was the ghostie of one of them old tramcar conductors a-hankering to clip a ticket again like in bygone days, see? And the same ghostie pinched the ham sandwich I've been saving for my breakfast, left now but crumbs. That's why I haven't rung head office neither, because what would be the use? If they did put in a pair of new escalator's and fix the lift, the new ones would be gone again by next day. That's what the voice means when it says nevermore."
"You think you can hear voices crying 'Help, help' down the lift shaft?" Dick went and listened, but there was nothing to be heard at that moment.
"Likely I'm the only man as can hear them," said Mr. Gumbrel.
"It seems to me I can smell something, though," said Dick, sniffing. Up from the lift shaft floated the usual smell of Tube Station, a queer, warm, dusty, metallic smell like powdered ginger. But as well as that, there was another smell, fragrant and tantalizing. "Smells to me like coffee," Dick said.
"Here you are, then," cried Mr. Gumbrel triumphantly. "They old tramcar drivers used to brew up a big pot of coffee when they was waiting for the last tram back to Brixton of a night time."
"I'd like to get some pictures of the station," said Dick. And he went over to the public call box and dialed his office to get a photographer. But as he waited with a coin in his hand, ready to put it in the slot when the pips went, something large and black suddenly wafted past his head in the gloom, snatched the receiver from him, and whispered harshly in his ear, "Nevermore." Next day the Rumbury Borough News had a headline, "Is our tube station haunted?" And beneath, "Mr. Gumbrel, ticket collector and booking clerk there for the last 40 years, asserts that it is. Ghosts of old-time tramcar drivers sit downstairs, he says, playing dominoes and drinking licorice water." Dick Otter had phoned his story from the call box in the sub-post office, and the girl in the newsroom had misheard drinking coffee as drinking toffee, which she quite rightly thought was nonsense, so she changed it to drinking licorice water.
"We shan't be able to meet people's eyes in the street," said Mrs. Jones at breakfast. "Going balmy, your Uncle Arthur is, without a doubt. Haunted tube station. Take him along to the doctor, shall I?"
The postman rang, with a letter on recorded delivery from a firm of lawyers, Messrs. Gum, Harbottle, Inkpen and Rule. It said, "Dear Madam, acting as solicitors for Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round, we wish to know when it will be convenient for you to pay the £817 and 67 pence worth of damage that you owe our clients for destruction of premises." Well, this threw Mrs. Jones into a dreadful flutter.
"That I should live to see the day when we're turned out of house and home on account of a black fiend of a bird, fetched in off the street by my own husband and dragged about on a red wooden truck by my own daughter."
"Well, you haven't lived to see the day yet," said Mr. Jones. "Wild creatures, ravens are counted as in law, so we can't be held responsible for the bird's actions. I'll go round and tell them so, and you better do something to cheer up Arabelle. I'd never seen a child so thin and mopey. He drove his taxi up to Round and Round, the record shop. But strangely enough, neither Mr. Round nor Mr. Toby Round was to be seen. The place was locked, silent, and dusty. After trying to persuade Arabelle to eat her breakfast, which was no use as Arabelle wouldn't touch it, Mrs. Jones decided to ring Uncle Arthur and tell him he should see a doctor for his nerves. She called up the tube station, but the telephone rang and rang, and nobody answered. In fact, the reason for this was that a great many sightseers, having read the piece in the newspaper, had come to stare at the station. And Mr. Gumbrel was having a fine time telling them all about the ways of the old tramcar drivers. While Mrs. Jones was still holding the telephone and listening to the bell ring, another bell rang, louder, the front door bell.
Trouble, trouble, nothing but trouble, grumbled Mrs. Jones. Here, Arabelle, lovey, hold the phone and say, "Hello, Uncle Arthur, Mum wants to speak to you if he answers, will you? Yes, I'll go and see who's at the front door."
Arabelle took the receiver, and Mrs. Jones went to the front door, where there were two policemen. She let out a screech.
"Ah, it's no use that pair of sharks sending you to arrest me for their £817. I haven't got it if you were to turn me upside down and shake me till September."
The police looked puzzled, and one of them said, "I reckon there's some mistake. We don't want to turn you upside down. We came to ask you if you recognise this." He held out a small object in the palm of his hand. Mrs. Jones had a close look at it.
"Why, certainly I do," she said. "That's Mr. Round's tie-pin, the one he had made from one of his back teeth when it fell out as he ate a plateful of Irish stew."
Meanwhile, Arabelle was still sitting on the stairs, holding the phone to her ear, when all at once she heard a hoarse whisper.
"Nevermore."
Arabelle was so astonished she almost dropped the telephone. She looked all round her. Nobody there. Then she looked back at the phone, but it had gone silent again. After a minute, a different voice barked,
"Who's that?"
Hello, Uncle Arthur, it's me, Arabelle. Mum wants to speak to you.
"Well, I don't want to speak to her,"
said Mr. Gumbrel, and he hung up. Arabelle sat on the stairs and said to herself,
That was Mortimer. He must be up at the tube station, because that's where Uncle Arthur is.
Arabelle had often travelled by tube and knew the way to the station. She got her red truck, and she put on her thick, warm, woolly coat, and she went out the back door because her mother was still talking at the front, and Arabelle didn't want to be stopped. She walked up the high street, past the bank. The manager looked out and said to himself, "That child's too young to be out on her own. I'd better follow her, find out who she belongs to." And he started after her. Next, Arabelle passed the supermarket. The manager looked out and said to himself, "That's Mrs. Jones's little girl. I'll just nip after her and ask her where her mother's got to today." So he followed Arabelle. Then she passed the Round and Round record shop, but there was nobody in it. And Mr. Jones had become tired of waiting and driven off in his taxi. Then she passed Peter Stone, the jeweller's. Peter Stone saw her through the window and thought, "That girl looks as if she knows where she means to go. And she was the only one who showed any sense after my burglary. Maybe it was a true story about the squirrel and the raven. Anyway, no harm following her to see where she goes." So he locked up his shop and followed. Arabelle passed the fire station. Usually the firemen waved to her. They'd been friendly ever since they had to come and climb in the Joneses' bathroom window. But today they were all hastily pulling on their helmets and rushing about, and just as she'd gone past, the fire engine shot out and by her going lickety-spit. Presently, Arabelle came to the tube station. The first person she saw there was her great-aunt, Annie Gumbrel.
"Arabelle Jones, what you doing walking up the high street by yourself? Liable to get run over and kidnapped and murdered and abducted and worse, the idea. Now, where's your mother, and where are you going?"
I'm looking for Mortimer, said Arabelle, and she kept on going. I've stayed on the same side all the way. I didn't have to cross over, she said over her shoulder as she went into the tube station. Aunt Annie had come up to the station to tell Uncle Arthur that he was behaving foolishly and had better come home, but she couldn't get near him because of the crowd. In fact, Arabelle was the only person who could get into the station entrance now because she was so small. There was just room for her, and then the place was completely crammed. Aunt Annie wasn't able to get in at all. When Arabelle was inside, someone kindly picked her up and set her on top of a ticket machine so that she could see. "What's happening?" she asked.
They reckon someone's stuck in the lift down at the bottom, so they're going to send down a fireman and he'll go through the trap door in the roof of the lift and fetch 'em back," said her great-uncle Arthur, who happened to be standing by her. "I've told 'em and told 'em 'tis the ghosties of old tram drivers, but they don't take no notice."
"Why don't they just send a train from Nutmeg Hill and get someone from it to go and see what the matter is?"
Train Drivers' Union won't let 'em stop. They say if it is the ghosties of old tram drivers stuck in the lift, it's a different union and no concern of theirs.
Now the fireman, who'd been taking a careful look at the lift, asked everyone to please step out into the street to make room. Then they rigged up a light, because the station was so dark, and they brought in a hoist, which was mostly used for rescuing people who got stuck up church spires or the roofs of burning buildings. They let down a fireman in a sling, and the whole population of Rumbury town, by now standing in the street outside, said, "Coo!" and held their breath. Presently a shout came from below.
"They've found someone,"
said the fireman, and everybody said, "Coo!" again, and held their breath some more. Just at this moment, Arabelle, still sitting on top of the ticket machine, for she was in no one's way there, felt a thump on her right shoulder. It was lucky that she put her thick, warm, woolly coat on, because 2 claws took hold of her shoulder with a grip like a bulldog clip, and a loving croak in her ear said, "Nevermore."
"Mortimer,"
said Arabelle. And she was so pleased that she might have toppled off the ticket machine if Mortimer hadn't spread out his wings like a tightrope walker's umbrella and balanced them both. Mortimer was just as pleased to see Arabelle as she was to see him. When he had them both balanced, he wrapped his left-hand wing round her and said, "Nevermore," 5 or 6 times over, in tones of great satisfaction and enthusiasm.
"Look, Mortimer, they're bringing someone up."
Slowly, slowly up came the sling, and who should climb out but Mr. Toby Round, looking hungry and sorry for himself. The minute he was landed, all sorts of helpful people, St. John ambulance men and stretcher-bearers and clergymen and the matron of Rumbury Hospital, all rushed at him with bandages and cups of tea and said, "Are you all right?" They would have taken him away, but he said he wanted to wait for his brother. The sling went down again at once. In a few minutes, up it came with the other Mr. Round. As soon as he landed, he noticed Arabelle and Mortimer perched on the ticket machine, and the sight of them seemed to set him in a passion. "Grab that bird," he shouted. "He's the cause of all the trouble, gnawed through the lift cable, ate the escalator, and had my brother and me trapped in utter discomfort for 48 hours.
"Then what was you a-doing down there," said Mr. Gumbrel suspiciously, "after the 9 o'clock South had come and gone?"
Just at this moment, a whole van-load of police arrived with Mrs. Jones, who seemed half distracted.
"There you are!" she screamed when she saw Arabelle. "And me, nearly frantic. Oh, my goodness, there's that great, awful bird, as if we hadn't enough to worry us."
But the police swarmed about the Round brothers, and the sergeant said, "I have a warrant to arrest you two on suspicion of having pinched the cash from the bank last month, and if you want to know why we think it's you that did it, it's because we've found your tooth tie-pin left behind in the safe and one of Toby's fingerprints on the abandoned motorbike, and I shouldn't wonder if you did the jobs at the supermarket and the jewellers and all the others too." "It's not true," shouted Mr. Toby Round. "We didn't do it. We didn't do any of them. We were staying with my sister-in-law at Romford on each occasion. Her name's Mrs. Flossie Wilkes, and she lives at 2001 Station Approach. If you ask my opinion, that raven is the thief." But the sergeant had pulled Mr. Toby Round's hand from his pocket to put a handcuff on it, and when he did so, what should come out as well but Sam the squirrel? And what should Sam be clutching in his paws but Mr. Peter Stone's diamond brooch? So everybody said, "Coo!" again, and Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round were taken off to Rumbury Hill Police Station. The police sergeant hitched a ride in the fireman's sling and went down the lift shaft and had a look round the old galleries and the disused tram station. He found the money that had been stolen from the bank, all packed in the plastic dustbins that had been stolen from Brown's the ironmonger's, and he found 999 of the 1,000 tins of best Jamaica blend coffee stolen from the supermarket, and a whole lot of other things that must have been stolen from different premises all over Rumbury town. While he was making these exciting discoveries down below, up above, Mrs. Jones was saying,
"Arabelle, you come home directly, and don't you dare go out on your own ever again."
"Nevermore," said Mortimer. So Arabelle climbed down from the ticket machine, with Mortimer still on her shoulder.
"Here,"
said Uncle Arthur, who'd been silent for a long time, turning things over in his mind.
"Yeah, Bird ought to be arrested too, if he's the one who ate my escatolers and put my lift out of order. How do we know he wasn't in with those blokes and the burglaries? He was the one that helped the squirrel make off with the diamond brooch.
He was flyjacked. He couldn't help it, said Arabelle.
Far from being arrested, said the bank manager, he'll get a reward from the bank for helping to bring the criminals to justice. And he'll get one from me too, said Peter Stone. And from me, said the supermarket manager.
Now come along, Arabelle, do, said Mrs. Jones. Oh, my gracious, look at the time. Your father will be home wanting his tea, wondering where in the world we've got to.
Arabelle collected her red truck, which she'd left outside, and Mortimer climbed onto it.
My stars, cried Mrs. Jones. You're not going to pull that great black sulky bird all the way home on the truck when we know perfectly well he can fly, the lazy thing. Never did I hear anything so outrageous, never.
He likes being pulled, said Arabelle.
So that was the way they went home. The bank manager and the supermarket manager and Mr. Peter Stone and quite a lot of other people saw them as far as the gate. Mr. Jones was inside and had just made a pot of tea. When he saw them come in the front gate, he poured out an egg cupful for Mortimer. They all sat round the kitchen table and had tea. Mortimer had several egg cupfuls. And as for Arabelle, she made up for all the meals she'd missed while Mortimer had been lost.